This is going to be the final video in the series on The Last of Us Laundromat. And if you saw the beginning of the series, the first and or maybe the second video, you'll note that this was the reference image that I was using, or this was the first thing that I had seen that inspired me to do a scene like this. And I started out really thinking that it was going to look as much as possible like this. And as I went on, I modeled many of the objects in the scene, but it started to take its own life. And so here is a collection of the thumbnails of what I did. The first video was just an introduction, so part 1 was there. Part 2, I'm modeling 3, 4, 5, and 6, and we're doing some texturing here. And now we're on part 13, which is this video where I'm going to show you the results of what I have put together. All right, so this is a screenshot of the scene with the objects in it. Many of them are instanced. That just made it easier. It was not that it was that important to me to conserve polys, of course, if you instance something. So, for example, this washing machine, if I make a collection and I bring in an instance of that, it makes it easy to make changes throughout all of them and to position them and stuff like that. But yeah, that's how that goes. So some of them were instanced, some of them were just arrayed. Anyways, I've got the washers and I've got the chairs. I've got 2 types of dryers. We've got the TVs in there and various other things. So there are some objects here that are definitely different than the reference image. And in the end, I've got some track lighting up here that's different, etc., etc. So like I say, it was inspired by The Last of Us Laundromat and then ended up becoming, my own kind of scene. All right, so a couple of things that I want to mention. I ended up putting a cube around, or a rectangle, I guess, around my whole scene in order to create some volumetric effects. For example, fog, which would interact with the lights, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So I just took a cube, scaled it up so that it fit everything, and the material on the cube basically was using this volume scatter node. You can see that that's plugged into the volume. So this is on the cube itself that surrounds everything. I also added a noise texture, pretty much used the default values through a color ramp plugged into the volume scatter, so that instead of having just a very constant fog, there are patches. You probably couldn't even really see them, but there would be patches where there would be less to no fog, so that it's there's some difference. It's not always just one consistent blanket level of fog. So that's something that I did for the lighting. And that was similar to the post-apocalyptic classroom as well. And the other thing that I have to think about in pretty much all of my renders is the lighting. Now, sometimes I work in cycles, but I often work in Eevee. And so, for example, you'll note that there are some panels of the ceiling that I put an emission on, as if those were like sort of rectangular lights. In cycles, that emission material that was on this sort of darker red rectangle or square would actually emit light. But in Eevee, it just looks bright. You see the emission, but it doesn't really emit light and cause shadows or anything. And so I had to think about, if I want to light my scene. I have a basic HDR, but it was on very low lighting because this ends up as a relatively sort of a night scene. So how am I going to light the interior of my scene? I'm going to probably use, if it's at night and I'm not using a sun or a spotlight, I'm going to use area lights and point lights. But if you just have area lights, or in particular point lights, just hanging around in the corners or near the ceiling, it looks fake. All right, it's just like all of a sudden there's a light source, but where's the light coming from? And so my plan was, wherever I had an emission from the ceiling, I would have an area light of similar size right underneath it. So I'll show you in my rendered images, there are a number of emissive ceiling tiles to act as lights, and I would have an area light underneath that. So that solved that. Okay, makes sense. That light is coming out of that, illuminating the area around it, the TV, the pillar, and stuff like that. And the same thing goes for these lights here that are facing sort of the windows. I wanted some light hitting the window and reflecting. And so, I had these lights, and this part here at the end of it is an emission. But again, in Eevee, it doesn't actually release light. And depending on the angle, you wouldn't even see that. You'll see that in the renders. So I brought in point light for each of these lights, made a collection, and then instanced them down. And so if I made a change to this light, the color or the intensity, all of them would be changed. And now it makes more sense that, okay, there's an emission here, so it should be releasing light, and this is the actual light source. So you need to think about that when you're lighting your scene, that the light makes sense. Unless it's sunlight coming through the windows, you just assume that that's what it is, and everybody understands that. But if you're lighting up an interior room, where's that? You don't always have to do this, but I would think I do it most of the time. All right, so I'm going to show you the final renders now. Of course, the modeling was done in Blender. The texturing was done primarily in Substance Painter with a very small amount in Blender itself. I rendered in Eevee, and then I did post-processing. All right, and you're pretty much always going to do that, even if you're a famous photographer, Annie Leibovitz, whatever, with a really good DSLR. They're pretty good at getting a good environment and the good lighting, and do a lot of stuff on camera exposure and focal length and stuff like that. But you're probably going to use Lightroom or whatever, and you're going to fix up your final shot, especially when there's money involved. And so I'm not ashamed to say that I do some post-processing. And so anyways, I use GIMP, and I have a software that I've talked about before that I use for photographs, and it just happens to do a nice job, I think, for the style I want. So I use Topaz Studio. All right, so anyways, final renders. All right, here's one kind of similar to the original. I think I've got my focal length set at about 20 for my camera, and I put some effects on. Most of the coloring is done through lighting within Blender, and so I just want to point out, you can see that my emissive lights are here, and there, of course, there are emissive lights here. You can barely see them anyhow, and so I've placed a point light at every one of these. I've adjusted the strength and the color, etc. Area lights around here, and of course I've got that volume scatter on, which creates some of that hazy like look. So this is a nighttime scene, I guess, at the laundromat. It's still open, and this is what we have. Many of the objects are objects that were in the original reference, and I tried to make, like the washer similar, the dryer similar, the TV similar, the walls and windows, but there are some differences, obviously. I'll show you a number of images, but this is the main thing. There's not much else to see here, really. The text stuff I may have mentioned in a vlog. I can't remember if I did or not, but I was having some problems, and because this is a long wall. I think when I first made it, I made it something like 50 or 60 feet long, and so it was taking up, as one long piece, a lot of the UV space. So I decided that I would cut it in half underneath this arch thing for the doors, so that I could just texture one half of it, and the other half would be mirrored over. I didn't really think about that as a problem. I knew that textures would repeat if you look closely at both sides, and if that's never going to happen. What I didn't realize was that when I add the decals for the text here, they were going to go on the other windows, which would have been okay, but they're mirrored. You're looking at this stuff from the inside, so it's got to look backwards. But on the mirrored one, the text looks forwards. This was in Substance Painter, and I could not find any way around it. I don't think there is a way around it. So instead I did this in Blender, and I have two versions of the decals. One is inverted and one isn't, and I just use images as planes, and therefore in the materials, in the shading editor, I have some grunge on here and some transparency, etc. So that's how I did that. That's the main material stuff I did in Blender. All right, so we're just going to have a look at a couple more. It's pretty much the same thing, but you might have a more of a preference for it. The post effects, post processing does give a particular look. As I started playing with renders, I started to enjoy the almost cartoony kind of look. It doesn't look very post-apocalyptic like I had wanted to when I started, but I started to enjoy this look, and I hope you think it looks nice. It is what it is. All right, so we'll just look at various views of this. Some of them are nicer shots than others, but you can see that the trash bin is in there. A couple of posters are in there. The ceiling fan is here. I actually had planned to do another ceiling fan, like a couple of them down this sort of aisle here, and then I guess I forgot, or I got busy with something else, and so there's just one there. Let's see if we get any closer to that. We got the clock in there, and our floor. You saw me text that, and I really left this wall untouched, and it does look kind of dumb in this image, I admit, but whatever. It's time to move on to something else. Here's just a row of the washers down here in this corner. Okay, there you can see the ceiling fan a little bit better. And that view. Some of these renders may have snuck in and not been particularly good, like this one. I'm not sure I had intended to keep that or not, but it is there. And another one, I think I might prefer that one a little bit more. I guess it is a 9:45 in the evening, so dark outside. There's nothing outside. However, you would expect you'd see buildings and street lights and stuff, but that gets into a whole other thing. In terms of the fan, I decided to go with the ceiling fan that doesn't have the lights on it, because I knew I was going to use the lights here. In fact, these are the lights from the fan. I took it off and I said, how would that look? I want some more lighting over here. I want to spruce this area up a little bit, and I think it was too dark otherwise. And so I decided I'm going to go without lights here, because you don't want to have too many points of light in the image as well, and it becomes distracting and stuff. And I think that might be the final scene. I'm not quite sure. All right, because there was a lot of modeling in there and a lot of texturing, but there's not really all that much to see. It's certainly not as much as those Naughty Dog guys would do. Is that the last one? Maybe that's the last one. That might be one of my favorite. I think that pretty much encompasses everything, shows everything I would need in there. All right, so that is probably video 13 or so of the series. That was a long one. It took a lot of work, but it's done, and I'm relatively happy with the way it turned out. I learned some things, as I always do, and I'm looking forward to doing more of the same. I briefly announced in a recent vlog about another Blender challenge. I'll leave that for another video, but there are other things coming along. So for those of you who watched this from the beginning, thank you so much for having the patience with me to get through to the end. And I hope that you think that the results were worth watching all that. Or if you decided to model any parts of this, whether it be the whole scene or a washer or a dryer or something, I hope it worked out well from you, and you enjoyed doing it. So thanks for spending your time here. If you are liking what I'm doing, I would appreciate you liking the videos and subscribing, and come on back for more. I'm going to do some Blender challenges, and we'll get back into some sci-fi stuff and some horror stuff, and of course more post-apocalyptic Last of Us kind of stuff, and some Resident Evil and some Uncharted, and I'm looking forward to doing lots more with you. All right, take care, and we'll see you again soon.